The intensifying diplomatic and military posturing surrounding Venezuela presents a critical inflection point for the foreign policy doctrines championed by President Donald Trump, specifically testing the limits of patience within his foundational Make America Great Again movement. The recent escalation is tangible. Following a significant buildup of military assets into the Caribbean Sea under the guise of an expanded anti-narcotics operation, the administration has moved from targeted interdictions to language that hints at regime change or substantial military engagement.
When pressed in recent interviews regarding the possibility of kinetic conflict with Caracas, President Trump conspicuously stated that he was not ruling out any options, an assertion accompanied by a declaration that Nicolas Maduro's tenure in power was drawing to a close. This deployment, which has reportedly involved striking over 24 drug-carrying vessels and is estimated to have resulted in more than 100 fatalities among cartel operatives, has undeniably raised the temperature in the region, bringing U.S. and Venezuelan forces into dangerously close proximity.
The administration's continued assertions that the U.S. is now fully surrounding the nation and plans for further expansion suggest a sustained pressure campaign, potentially culminating in scenarios previously considered unlikely. This complex tapestry of escalating force and increasingly explicit threats immediately runs counter to the isolationist America First philosophy that MAGA adopted as its primary mandate during the campaign trail, which promised to halt the trend of endless wars.
The current dynamic places the president at a delicate crossroads, forcing him to reconcile his tough-on-crime, anti-drug stance with the non-interventionist desires of his base. It is likely that the relatively contained nature of the current military actions, the maritime interdictions occurring primarily in international waters, has thus far insulated the administration from widespread conservative dissent. Republican strategists familiar with the MAGA mindset observe that the base currently accepts these operations because they are framed internally not as a preparation for war, but as an essential national security mission directly targeting the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. This framing leverages the concept of peace through strength, a doctrine that previously allowed the administration to conduct limited strikes against Houthi forces in Yemen or target Iranian nuclear facilities without incurring significant political cost. However, the political elasticity afforded by these low-casualty, seemingly low-cost operations appears to be reaching its breaking point.
One significant hypothesis emerging from conservative think tanks is that the crucial distinction lies between targeted interdiction and actual regime change through sustained military action. While the base may cheer the destruction of cartel speedboats, seeing it as a necessary defense of the homeland, it is generally understood that any action involving a full-scale ground invasion or an extended air campaign aimed at destabilizing the Maduro government would trigger a fierce, perhaps irreconcilable, split within the conservative movement.
Analysts caution that the base's tolerance is predicated on the political and human cost remaining low, specifically avoiding U.S. casualties or the depletion of critical military hardware. Should the intervention expand to a high-cost, high-profile war of choice, the president would be directly violating the central pledge to end, not start, foreign conflicts. The political cost of such a pivot cannot be overstated. Recent surveys suggest that a majority of conservatives do not support the president's view that he possesses the unilateral authority to initiate such an action without congressional approval, indicating a foundational disagreement regarding the scope of executive power in foreign conflict.
The White House press secretaries, in attempting to manage this delicate balance, have consistently sought to deflect accusations of warmongering, framing all actions as purely defensive and anti-narcotics driven. They emphasize that the president's focus remains squarely on peace and eliminating the flow of drugs responsible for devastating communities across the U.S.
This deliberate strategic ambiguity serves a dual purpose. It allows the administration to maintain a deterrent posture against Maduro, suggesting unpredictability and the potential for decisive action, while simultaneously assuring the domestic audience that the core mission is one of domestic protection, not foreign entanglement.
This calculated vagueness permits the president to increase pressure, such as authorizing covert CIA operations or threatening strikes against criminal gangs inside Venezuela,
without committing fully to a step that would undoubtedly ignite the internal political debate he seeks to avoid. However, political analysts argue that this ambiguous stance merely defers the inevitable reckoning. The reason MAGA dissent has not yet reached a critical mass, according to experts, is not necessarily full agreement with the policy, but rather the low political impact of the actions taken to date. If the U.S. were to cross the threshold into full regime change operation, the attendant costs, in terms of resources, lives, and international scrutiny, would skyrocket, instantly drawing explosive attention and fierce opposition from the non-interventionist right wing, who already harbor deep skepticism regarding previous disagreements over Ukraine or Iran policy. The eventual decision regarding military intervention thus represents a profound test of the core identity of the MAGA movement, whether its loyalty to the president outweighs its fundamental commitment to prioritizing American lives and resources over foreign conflicts. As Maduro continues to defy U.S. pressure, notably ordering the Venezuelan Navy to escort oil tankers to deter potential U.S. seizures, the window for the administration to maintain its delicate balancing act between tough rhetoric and non-intervention may be rapidly closing, pushing the political environment closer to a highly divisive internal confrontation. The immediate flashpoint for this potential confrontation lies in the stark ideological chasm between the administration's aggressive posturing and the foundational promises of the America First movement. MAGA was built on a rejection of costly, protracted overseas nation-building and regime change wars, prioritizing domestic revitalization over international intervention.
This core conflict centers precisely on differentiating between acceptable law enforcement actions and unacceptable geopolitical escalation. While the current offshore drug interdiction campaign appears, by most accounts, tolerable to the conservative base, framed as a necessary domestic security measure and an application of peace through strength, the moment the administration shifts the narrative from countering drug cartels to prosecuting a regime change war, the political calculus changes completely.
Republican strategists, including Matt Terrell, have observed that the base currently accepts these maritime operations because they are carefully presented as targeted, anti-narcotics missions deemed crucial for national security, importantly, without incurring U.S. troop casualties or significant resource depletion. This acceptance, however, is highly conditional. The White House, in its official capacity, has vigorously attempted to reinforce this narrow framing. Press secretaries like Carolyn Leavitt and Anna Kelly emphasize that the president's focus remains squarely on peace and ending the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. One prevailing hypothesis suggests that this sustained rhetorical effort is a calculated political maneuver, utilizing the universally acceptable mandate of counter-narcotics, a core conservative concern, as necessary political cover to ratchet up geopolitical pressure on the Maduro regime. Yet this strategy is inherently fragile. If the administration were to proceed with a ground offensive or sustained aerial bombardment aimed at collapsing the regime in Caracas, it is highly likely that the current political consensus would shatter instantly. Experts familiar with the conservative landscape have made this distinction unequivocally clear.
Rachel Bovard, speaking for a significant segment of the conservative establishment, articulated the mood precisely, noting that while the base is perfectly content with blowing up drug boats to secure borders, they hold profound opposition to initiating a land war with Venezuela. Similarly, Justin Logan, an analyst on foreign policy, points out that the muted MAGA reaction thus far should not be misinterpreted as policy endorsement, but rather as a reflection of the low political cost associated with the administration's actions up to this point. Logan argues that the threshold for dissent is directly tied to the cost. Once the price rises, in terms of casualties, the duration of the conflict, and financial expenditure, political attention and subsequent disagreement are projected to explode across the conservative ecosystem.
Furthermore, the president's assertion that he possesses the executive authority to bypass Congress for decisive military action runs contrary to the expressed wishes of a significant portion of his own supporters. Recent polling data indicates that a considerable percentage of conservatives do not agree with the notion of the executive branch circumventing Congress to declare or enter war, and a majority feel the administration has not adequately articulated the strategic rationale for the potential use of force in Venezuela.
This procedural disagreement serves to amplify the deeper ideological rift over interventionism. The current ambiguity employed by the administration, simultaneously hinting at military action quite soon while leaving the diplomatic door ajar, has been an effective tactical tool, feeding the image of an unpredictable and decisive leader intent on keeping adversaries off balance, a hallmark of this presidency.
However, this tactic cannot endure indefinitely. The endgame demands a fundamental choice: escalation against Maduro, especially if it devolves into a protracted conflict, would likely trigger the intense internal debate that policy analyst Kurt Mills warns would be far more corrosive to the MAGA coalition than previous disagreements over conflicts in Ukraine or Iran.
The president's ability to successfully execute his stated goal of achieving peace through strength depends entirely on whether that strength results in a swift, decisive outcome, or if it deteriorates into the very quagmire he promised on the campaign trail to avoid. Ultimately, the political loyalty of the MAGA movement appears willing to overlook aggressive foreign policy posturing only so long as it does not fundamentally violate the core America First covenant of non-interventionism.
If the administration crosses the critical threshold from tactical counter-narcotics enforcement into protracted regime change, the political cost may prove prohibitive, potentially fracturing the very coalition responsible for securing his power. The analysis and commentary presented in this video are based solely on publicly available sources and represent the channel's own perspective, relying on careful interpretation of expert statements and political data.
The dynamics unfolding around Venezuela confirm one inescapable truth for any modern political leader. When foreign policy deviates too far from the core isolationist promises made to an anti-war base, even the most dedicated political movements will eventually exhaust their patience, signaling the dangerous limits of rhetorical domination when confronted by the harsh realities of potential military engagement.
The clock is now ticking not merely for the regime in Caracas, but for the delicate cohesion of the conservative movement dedicated to putting America first.